Welcome to the Philanthropy Masterminds podcast, brought to you by DonorSearch, the show that takes you inside the lives of thought leaders, innovators, and change makers in fundraising, philanthropy, and civil society. I'm your host, Jay Frost. In today's episode, we speak with Tony Myers, internationally acclaimed consultant, strategist, author, speaker, teacher, mentor, board member, and executive coach, who has guided leaders to realize their vision, mission, and financial goals at over 60 nonprofit organizations on 6 continents. Dedicated to building a sector guided by sustainability, accountability, and leadership, his approach is to listen first, seek deep understanding, identify challenges, and then find ways to work collaboratively to meet those challenges head on. We began our conversation in an exploration of his earliest days, learn how he found the juice to persist when others only saw limits, and discover his vision for a world driven by love. And you talked about coming from a family of 9. Where was that, and what was that like?
It was a formative time, Jay, and it was in just a small town at the time outside of Toronto, Ontario, in Canada, and the small town at the time was about 3,500 people, and it was called Oakville. Well, today Oakville's 250,000 people, but that was back then. What was it like? It was an adventure. It was challenging living in a small house with 11 people. There was never enough space. and you could never find your stuff, And I think that forced me in as I grew older to be super organized and keep my stuff close at hand and in an organized fashion so I could find it. But it was interesting. It was challenging because you needed to take care of yourself. It was challenging because you needed to be your own person in a larger group. Yes, you depended on others. You worked in a team, but you needed to be your own person. And to get ahead, you needed to find your own space and time, and I think discipline. So it was I never would ever look back and say, "Oh my gosh, I was hard done by." I would look back and say that I was really fortunate to have had that opportunity that were really formative in terms of my values, in terms of my habits as a human being, and in terms of my character building. So I'm indebted for that opportunity. At the same time, it was tough, but it's okay. It was tough because you learn from tough experiences and you grow from tough experiences. And I think I learned and I grew and I benefited. So it was good.
Some people talk about how when there's 9 kids, it means that they're naturally close because they're physically close. But for others, that's not always true, especially when they're trying to divvy up the food at dinner time. Were you close to your siblings, and are you today?
I think we are close and surprisingly close. And interesting you mentioned dinner, because there were times at dinner where, you were hungry, mm-hmm. and there wasn't enough food, and you went to bed hungry. And there were times when the frost on the windows were on the inside, not the outside. So it was there were interesting times, and again as I look back, Jay, they some of them were tough times, and in a large family, sometimes it's tough to get the attention of your parents. It's tough to get airtime, and but again, you grow from that and you learn from that, and I think you build character from that, and if you're able to take it and to move it in the right direction, you can benefit from that. And I think at the end of the day, I did benefit from that.
Can you talk about your parents a little bit?
Ooh, what an interesting question. My my father was spent time in the army, and he was in the First World War, and he came home and had built into his psyche the whole army thing in the background, and that's how he did his discipline, as most dads, I think, or many dads did in those days. He was a jeweler, he's an incredibly hardworking man, and averse to risk, oddly enough, and averse to risk probably because he had a very limited education. I think he had grade 9, maybe grade 10. My mother was the same in term her education. My mother was my mother taught me I could do anything I wanted to, within reason. I remember once, and this was a formative moment in my life. We would go home, 9 kids, you can imagine, go home. My mother would be resting in the afternoon, and she might be getting up from a nap, and we'd all climb up on my mom and dad's bed and sit around, and we chat about our day, and chat about school, and talk about things, just talk. And they were really special times. I remember once struggling to wonder what I would be when I grow up. And I was really, really troubled by this. And as we had this conversation, she told me that I needn't worry, that in fact I could be anybody I wanted to be within reason. And within reason, those who know me know I'm a short man. And so within reason means I would never be an NBA basketball player, but I could do anything I wanted to do within reason, and I think I've lived my life that way. I think if you can think it, you can do it, and I think things and I do them, and what a positive affirmation as a young person, and to be able to carry that through life. A single interaction with your parents. So she was my cheerleader, my supporter, my confidant, my inspiration.
So what were some of the things that you talked about doing and being when you got older as a child, talking with your mom?
I had trouble getting through high school, Jay. I spent 8 years in getting through high school, which is a formidable amount of time. And 8 years of getting through high school, but I got through. I had to leave home because I couldn't study at home, interesting enough. With 9 kids, you there's no room to study. There's no time to study. There's no space to study. Mm-hmm. So I literally had to leave home in order to finish high school, because I needed to study to get out of high school. I wasn't a great student. I'm a slow learner, a slow reader, and I found it hard to learn. So I left home. And because I finally realized I wanted to, at some point in my life, I wanted to get married, have kids, and teach, and I didn't want to work as hard as my mom and dad. So I determined I needed an education to do that. And to get an education, I needed to leave home. To be a teacher, I needed to go to university. To go to university, I needed to get out of high school. So I left and I lived on my own for 2 years, in the last 2 years of high school, and got through, and then accepted to 4 universities, which I was thrilled in, and attended one. The other thing that was inspirational is that for me, Jay, is the motivation of my life is to tell me I can't. I remember a guidance counselor telling my mother that I would never get out of high school, and I remember she telling me that, and I remember me committing to, in fact, doing the opposite. And did. So I finished high school. I went on to university. I got 2 undergraduate degrees. I went on to do a master's and finally a PhD, and never to be academic. I always wanted to understand deeply understand the world of philanthropy and how it worked, so I could practice it, and so I could engage in it, so I could excel in it, so I could help others be successful. So yeah,
this drive you're describing is something I've heard before from family and friends, other people I've met. sometimes it's driven in response to things. It sounds like it was both something that you knew you could do. You had that support from especially from your mom, um, uh, but also in response to people saying you can't, and that's very remarkable, because some people just stop at what people were told they couldn't do, but you kept going and going. Where did you continue to find the juice to do that?
Mm. The juice is found in joy and purpose. Um, I remember, what is it? The 8 habits of is it 8 habits of highly effective people?
Maybe seven habits.
7 habits. Yes.
I never remember the title either.
Yeah. It is 7 habits of highly effective people. And who wrote that? It was I'm trying to think. In any event, I had an opportunity to take a course, and was privileged to take a course on 7 habits of highly effective people, and out of that course, I was able to develop a personal vision statement, a personal mission statement, and it's continued to develop. And I think I was around 35 or 40 when I did that. But ultimately I found a purpose and a vision for life, and I found that both through that course and through my work. And in my purpose in life is to help others be successful, and to live within the laws of nature. And I refer to laws of nature as the laws of common sense, about treating other people kindly, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And I don't want to sound philosophical by doing that, but I really do believe that my role in life is to serve and to help others be successful. And by doing that, that's brought me joy. My vision in life is a world driven by and guided by philanthropy. And it's just so simple, because philanthropy is the love of humankind. And so a world driven by love is a much different world than in much of the world that we see today, at least in politics and in international affairs, and particularly with what's going on with Russia and Ukraine and a lot of disruption that's going on globally. So I think those two things have given me joy and given me the juice to keep going. And even today, it is the joy of helping and supporting others. And it gets me out of bed every morning, and it's the greatest reward you can have, and it feeds me, and gives me that juice to continue.
Now, the word philanthropy itself, and you just defined it. It's always helpful to revisit that, which you've just done. But that's not a word that most of us know when we're kids, and it may not even be something we see an example of when we're young. Did you see something as a kind of a model of people helping others, either at home or outside the home, when you were young? And then when did you understand that to be what you're now describing as philanthropy, the thing that you studied and that you practice?
It's interesting. It's a great question. I found philanthropy through fundraising. I didn't find fundraising through philanthropy. Mm. I was so fortunate to attend St. Mary's University in Minnesota, in Winona, Minnesota, and do a master's in philanthropy and development. And as part of that program, and you may have heard it from others, is that you needed to write your own philanthropic autobiography. And so I had to go back and figure out where did I find this? Where did I find this my philanthropy? Where did I find my sense of giving? And there's two sides of that. One is the philosophical side, which is the spiritual, value-driven side, and the other is the skill side. So the skill side actually came to me first, and at the age of 10 or 12, my father was involved in a number of different clubs in town, the Kiwanis Club, the Lions Club, Optimist Club, whatever those clubs were. And they were a big thing back in the day, particularly following the Second World War. And they were community building clubs. And so there were always raffles, and those raffles were tickets. And, I think if you sold 10 tickets, you got tickets were a dime a piece or something crazy like that. And if you sold 10 tickets, you got to keep a dime. So I used to go door to door and sell these tickets for my father because he was responsible for selling so many books of tickets. And he gave them to his son who wanted to make a dime on a dollar or something. What was it, 10% return on investment? Not bad in those days. But so I went door to door, and then he would coach me on sales, interesting enough. And, you knock on the door and you look somebody straight in the eye and you pose the question and you shut your mouth, the same things we learn about asking for money. And so that was a wonderful experience, and then I was in a fraternity in high school, and we used to have fundraisers that we raised money for causes. And so that was an early experience. And then when I graduated and I went into journalism, and in journalism, you learn to talk to people because you interview people all the time. That's how you gather stories and gather information, because the role of the journalist is to tell a story and to gather information. So you learn so you bring all of those things together, and it helps develop the skills you need in my case, as a major donor fundraiser and somebody who works on capital campaigns. On the spiritual side, the value side is I guess I go back to my mom, who was involved in the community and worked on a crisis line, and my mom and dad who were awarded as citizens of distinction in our hometown because of the volunteer work they did. And so I think we all learn this by example, and by those who we see. And so I don't know if there's any one experience, Jay, but there's a combination of a number of experiences that come to play. And Jay, when I graduated from St. Mary's University of Minnesota, I was dying to find out where, actually, the answer to your question. I was dying to find out where people learn their philanthropy.
Right.
And actually, I did a study. I interviewed, at one point in my life, I interviewed 22 to 25 major donors and high net worth individuals, and talked to them about where they learned their philanthropy, how they learned it, and how they went about it. And it was a fascinating experience to have those conversations, and they were among the most amazing conversations I think I've ever had with a group of people in my life, because when you talk to people about giving, not about giving money, you talk to people about giving, about the most important gift they've ever given. When you talk to people about where they volunteer and why they volunteer, when you talk to people about gifts they've received, they tell you incredible stories, and when you talk to people about giving, about receiving, and about volunteering, you're able to go to the heart of their philanthropy. Jay, some of the things we learned in that were just some of the most fascinating things I ever, people talk to me. When I ask people, now, again, I'm talking to major donors and high net worth individuals. So I talk to these people about the most important gift they've ever received. And you'd be absolutely amazed at the answers you got. One was one answer, just to give you a couple examples. One answer was, the most important gift I ever received was a job by my uncle on his farm, driving a truck, even though there was no job, because it kept him out of trouble when he was 16 years old. Another answer I got from a high net worth individual was I think it was a loan of $1,000 from his parents that resulted in his ability to maintain his company, which then he sold for $82 million some years later. Other answers were blankets from a friend, pictures after there was a fire in my house, um, um, conversation during postpartum depression. The greatest gifts people ever received. So when you talk to people about gifts and about giving and about receiving, and if you're able to have, you literally go to the heart and soul of their philanthropy, and you find out what makes them tick, what their values are. And what's so fascinating about that, Jay, is that, people don't give from their wallets. They give from their heart and from their values. And if you know people's values, and if you're able to connect their values with the values associated with your cause, you don't need to raise money. You just connect the values.
It strikes me as you say this, Tony, that not everybody has the opportunity to have that kind of conversation or to do that kind of autobiography that you described that you did at the university for your master's. How important is that to not just what we do, but to these people, to ourselves, to first go through that autobiographical process and be able to say, this is where I came from, this is what really moves me, and then to maybe have those conversations with others. Sometimes it's for fundraising, sure, but maybe it's just to give people the opportunity to kind of do that self-inventory and have the privilege of describing what moves them.
It is important. I mean, how important is incredibly important, Jay. And we both know that it's so important. Why is it important, I think, is the question that we really want to get at. And I think that's what you mean by your question. I think it's important for all of us involved in philanthropy to go to the heart of our own philanthropy, because if we're able to go to the heart of our own philanthropy, if we're able to go and understand our own values, then it gives us, it's the starting point for connecting with others. It's got to be the starting point for connecting others. In addition to that, Jay, if we don't go there ourselves, then how can we go there with others? And some may argue you can, and I won't deny that. But if you are able to go there yourself, and if you are able to take a deep dive on your own values, if you're able to take a deep dive on your own philanthropy, you can help others take a deep dive on theirs. I've never called myself a philanthropist. I think we all are, but I don't know why I don't. But I've never called my philanthropist. But I think that philanthropy is at the heart of who I am, and what I do. Mm-hmm. And that allows me to help others get there. It allows me to help others get there. And if you help others get there, there's no limit to what others will give. And there truly is no limit to what others will give. When you're able to touch the core of their being, the heart of their person, the core of their philanthropy, you're able to connect them largely or minimally or small to your cause. And whenever you're made that connection, you're not fundraising, you're giving your donor the joy of giving. You're giving your donor the joy of making a difference. Mm-hmm. And money is just only a tool. It's just a tool to help to realize the higher purpose. In difficult economic times, Jay, and we're talking now, globally, we're talking about, are we going to go into recession, and to what degree are we going to go into recession, and will there be a depression? And it seems to be modifying a little bit now, but that's been the conversation over the last 6 months in a post-pandemic time. And when I've worked with people during difficult economic times, I try to instill in people that there's no limit to love. There's limits to money, I think. we only have as much as we have, or don't have as much as we don't have. But there's no limit. You don't need to put a limit on love or put a limit on philanthropy. And if we're able to approach, particularly major donor giving from a philanthropic point of view, then we're able to go much further than a one-off gift, or we're able to go much further and than just just getting the money. It's not about the money. It's about values and making the value connection with another human being.
It strikes me as you're talking about much of this that you also gained a tool set rather early. Right out of high school, you're in college, and then working in journalism for storytelling, sure, but also maybe for knowing which questions to ask in order to elicit those stories. Then you talked about these interviews you did later and everything for the person who received the blanket and the person who drove the truck and all these things which were so critical to them and who they are. How much of those experiences did those people even understand before they were asked those questions? Do we need the questions to get there,
Yeah. Let me go back and then we go forward, because there's something I just wanted to clarify, and I did not learn it young. Jay, I will answer your question. I did not learn it young. Mm-hmm. I think I was middle-aged, and I didn't do a master's until I was 50. I didn't do a PhD until I was 60. So these were not young learnings; they were middle life learnings. And even today, those people that I mentor, and mentoring is one of the things that I love to do most about my work. Is even those people I mentor who might be frustrated at 35, might be frustrated at 40, might be frustrated at 45. I need to remind them that I did not find philanthropy until I was 50. And then for the last 25 years, I've been able to practice that. But it wasn't until 50 that I found philanthropy. You're correct in the assumption that I had skills that I developed earlier in life that I was able to bring to philanthropy. But it wasn't until I was 50 that I found it. And in my second half of my life, or third quarter, or third inning, whatever you want to call it, that I was able to practice it. Back to your question, though, how did were people able, and if I understood your question correctly, were the people able to realize their own core philanthropy before you asked the question? Then my answer was, I don't think so. I think that they would have been unconsciously aware of their own philanthropy, but not consciously aware. And it is through becoming consciously aware of our own values, but by becoming consciously aware of our own, and I'll even call it a need, Jay, that we can pursue our own values and pursue our own needs, and that is a need to make a difference, a need to give, a need to feel the satisfaction of a legacy of some kind that you can leave in the world. And I think that comes from a conscious awareness of that. And I think part of the role I have to play is helping people become consciously aware of their own values, consciously aware of their own skills and abilities, consciously aware of the contributions they have made to society, and consciously aware of the contributions they can make to society. So I see that as much of my job as raising money, and as a consultant, then I see that as much of my job as helping people learn the discipline associated with philanthropy. Let me just add one more thing, if I could, Jay. One of the things the most valuable things I learned in the work I've done is that I've learned to make a distinction between fundraising, development, and philanthropy. And in writing about this stuff, I've been able to make a distinction, knowing that fundraising is a skill, development is a discipline, and philanthropy is a philosophy. And the challenge and the frustration I face is I spend so much of my life spending time teaching others the skill and the discipline, and it takes so long to get to the philosophy, because people people don't seem to be willing to dive into the values and philosophy of fundraising and or dive into the values of philanthropy until they know the skills and the development, because that the skills and the discipline, because that makes them comfortable in moving forward. So, but it is the most exciting part of the work I do, is when you get down to that human interaction and value-driven conversations, that magic occurs.
I was going to ask you why that's the case, but I think you've just explained it. But maybe I can ask that in another way, because that's such a beautiful way that you've described that, about coming to the point in one's life where we can be interested in exploring the philosophy behind the things that we and others do, and philanthropy being the architecture for understanding many of those things. You talked about how you came to the educational part of much of this when you were 50, and then when you were 60, going and getting these additional, not just degrees, but your way of exploring these topics. What if you were to talk to a younger Tony? So Tony at 25 or 30, you picked the date and asked him if he was interested in exploring the philosophy of philanthropy versus going out there and raising the money for whatever the cause was you were working with at the time. Would you have understood it at that time? I mean, why do we come to this when we come to it? And would you have understood it back then?
Short answer is I don't think so, Jay. I don't think I understood it. It would have understood it at 25. I think the rare person can understand it at 25. But at 25, you have, you're either new to a life partner, or you're still aware of you want to a life partner. You at 25, you're beginning a career and wondering, where's the money going to come from, for my rent, and do I have enough to live for the year, and will I be able to buy a vehicle so I can get around, and will I be able to travel? I think there's other things in life that you're still exploring, and let me give you a very practical answer to that question. And the practical answer to that question, Jay, comes from understanding. I learned this from my financial advisor. It comes from understanding the life cycle of financial life cycle of most people. And you've heard this before, I'm sure, but the life cycle is driven by, first of all, is by acquisition of wealth. Second is by growth and protection, and the third is by dissemination. We can't take it with us. So when you in the wealth cycle, you're just acquiring wealth and goods as a young person, and so it it's about sustainability, and it's about comfort, it's about safety, it's about the hierarchy of needs when you're young, safe and eat and sleep, and can I do those things? Do I have enough money to do that? Middle age, we're marrying our kids, going to university, and we're about growing anything that we might have acquired and protecting it for old age. And in old age, we realize if we are fortunate enough to have enough, then we can disseminate it or get rid of it before we go and direct where it's going to go. So at a young age, we're in terms of a wealth cycle or a financial cycle or a sustainability cycle, we're still acquiring those things we need in order to live a life. And so to think at a higher level is difficult for most, I think.
That makes perfect sense, that we have to meet the challenges of life where we are, and then it also means that it informs our understanding of those things. We have a language for them, maybe. I asked you whether Tony at 25 or 30 would have thought of these things in that way or understood them that way, but I didn't ask you what you were doing then. And I know you were working in a number of different positions and gaining these skills and applying them early on in those that more formative part of your career with fundraising and development before you really invested yourself fully as you do today in philanthropy and mentoring of others. Do you mind just taking us very quickly on a tour of where you cut your teeth doing this work before you started doing the work that you do today?
Yes, and just maybe 60 seconds, and just to trace that, Jay, I graduated from university and went to work as a photographer in a television station, and I went there because it was the first job I could get, and I had a professor who had a link in broadcasting and helped me get started because I did a degree in English and communications. As a photographer, I found I was shooting news and public affairs, and I was shooting film, and I found I was frustrated with those who were in front of the camera. I was behind the camera, and felt I could do a better job. So I wanted to go into journalism. So I went, and I went into journalism, and I did my own public affairs program 5 days a week. I worked as a TV reporter for a number of years, and ran into legal problems as a TV reporter because I was uncovering stories that were much bigger than I was, and they were national stories. And I was sending these stories to national programs because they were bigger than I was. And I found out I wanted to know more about the law, so I went to law school. And I went to law school to become a better journalist, not to become a lawyer. When I graduated from law school, I went back into journalism, and I went in our capital city here in Canada, in Ottawa, and worked for the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation as a reporter there and in journalism. And after that, I went into teaching. So I taught for 5 years, and after teaching for 5 years, I went into communications in government communications, and I worked inside government in communication. Did that for 6 years, and then I went to a university and I did communications for one of Canada's largest universities, and was head of communications for that organization. And at that time, we transitioned from into our first ever fundraising campaign, which was ended up to be a $200 million campaign at the time, and that was some 10 or 20 years ago, 25 years ago. And that's where I made the transition from communications to fundraising, and worked for 2 or 3 different organizations, and finally ended up as advisor to a president of one of Canada's largest universities, and from there worked with him to help to help on the fundraising side, to help a major project side, and to be his advisor on that. And then when established my own consulting company in 2008, and have worked in globally since then, and worked and taught and spoke and on 6 continents around the world. So that's the kind of short version.
That's quite a Reader's Digest version of a really stellar career before you were doing what people know you to do today. And it also strikes me that this kind of wall that often exists in many not-for-profit organizations, universities, and other places, it didn't seem to be a factor for you, or you managed to jump over it pretty easily. And that's between communications and fundraising, or development and marketing, or whatever we want to call those silos. I want to ask you about that just briefly before we tackle the big things that are moving you now. For those organizations that find themselves with these silos that exist, where sometimes people kind of scowl at one another, or they live in different zip codes, I'm wondering, do you have any words of sage advice for them to see that it's possible to go from a world of communicating with others to inviting others to invest in the things that they both believe in?
As you began to pose the question, Jay, the number one thing that comes back to me is leadership. And leadership on 2 fronts, if I might. Leadership on in the organization. I was so blessed to work with an incredible leader at the time when I made that transition, and that leader brought together in the university environment, he brought together alumni and communications and fundraising all under the same roof. And so the transition between any one or two of those disciplines or three of those disciplines was very possible and very much supported. So we worked together as a team. So a leader who sees the interaction and interplay between alumni and development and communications. So that was the first reason. The second reason, I think, was leadership of self. We grow to the point where we realize that at some point in our career that others are not responsible for our success. That at some point in our career, we need to realize that we are responsible for ourselves. And yes, we all need mentors. We all need people to support us. We all need supporters in our own organization. But at the end of the day, we need to support ourselves, and we need to design the future for ourselves. And we need to, and we need to not selfishly take care of ourselves, but we need to design our own future and follow our own path and be responsible for that. So I think leadership of self and leadership in organization are the two things that made that transition possible. Mm-hmm. And so if you're working in a silo, you either find a way to lead yourself to the next part of that silo, or lead yourself out of the organization and go someplace where your aspirations can be realized.
Now, you just touched on mentoring, which I know is deeply important to you. Where did that start to inform the way you've thought about all these things, and where is it today?
It comes from two places, Jay. One, it comes from my personal mission statement, which is my goal in life is to help others be successful, mm-hmm. and to live within the laws of nature. And to be others successful, then you have to help others one way or the other. And some can pay you for your time and effort, and others cannot, and do not. The second place that comes from is I was given the gift of a mentor when I came to the profession, and it was an incredible gift. And this individual who was my mentor was able to give me the skills, the discipline, and introduce me to the philosophy, and was highly skilled, highly motivated, and incredibly helpful. I think that those people I know who have succeeded in any aspect of life have done so because they were gifted with a mentor, or they sought out a mentor through which they could discover their profession, discover themselves and their own values, and discover the skill sets they needed to acquire in order to be successful. And I have been the recipient of an incredible mentor, a number of incredible mentors, but certainly one that I'll always be appreciative of, who brought me to fundraising, then to development, and then to philanthropy.
Is this something that benefits us at any point in our life? Because you've talked about how you've done many things, and you've done many of them at times when many people say, well, I guess I've done my bit. But you just keep going and going, and acquiring new skills and doing new things. Can one acquire or be gifted a mentor and be able to transition through these different parts of our lives at any point in our life?
Absolutely. From my perspective, absolutely. Yeah. Some of us are gifted with a mentor. Some of us have to find a mentor. Some of us need to choose to seek out somebody who can help them. And I don't want to sound over biblical here, but ask and you shall receive, and knock and the door shall be open. And it's just so true. The other thing that, Jay, is so true, and this keeps on happening to me in my life, and even now, I'll argue I'm reinventing myself. Even now, when you determine what it is you want from the universe, and you declare what it is you want in your own mind, and you pursue it, than physically. I mean, you've got to do something. My mother used to say, God helps those who help themselves. But if you put it out to the universe and you go after it, the world follows you. It's just the most incredible thing. It happened to me when I did my master's. It happened to me when I did my PhD. It happened to me when I was fundraising. It happened to me, when I changed careers. It's happened to me every time I change careers. It's happened to me every time I do a major project. You think it, you want to do it, you declare you want to do it, you go after it, and the universe follows you and supports you. It's just the most amazing thing that happens.
Now, today you are doing many things with many organizations, and it doesn't look like in a standard bio or on a website that you describe these as necessarily as mentoring, but there's an aspect of it which clearly looks like that many of these organizations that you work with are all around the world. And the way that I finally, very late in my life, became acquainted with you was this work that you've done with organizations in Ukraine in the midst of a hot war for the first time in that part of Europe for many decades. How is it that you're finding these people who clearly benefit from not just having the skills and the discipline, but this way of thinking about how anything is really possible, even in the worst kind of catastrophe like they're experiencing? How are you finding them? How are they finding you? And how are you finding, in your words, the joy of guiding them through what is a very difficult time towards hopefully a better end for themselves, their organizations, and the people that they serve?
Great question. When you asked how do I find these people, my mind went immediately to the fact I don't. They find me, and the question then is, how do they find me? And they find me because I'm out there doing what I love, and they find me because I have been able to follow my vision and mission. They find me because I've been able to live in alignment with my skills and abilities and my desire. They find me because the work I do is joyful. And I and I aspire to do excellent work regardless of what is paid for that work, or whether in fact it is paid for or not. So the short answer is they find me. How did I find Ukraine? It's interesting, and the short story is that I started to work in Central and Eastern Europe because I did some volunteer work there. I worked at the international. I've spoken for the last 25 years at the International Fundraising Conference. Part of that speaking there has introduced me people throughout Europe, and the way I got to Ukraine, ironically, was through Moscow. And I was invited twice prior to the war, in 2016 and 2019, to speak at the Russian National Fundraising Conference and to share what I knew about major donor fundraising and work with nonprofit organizations in Russia who were struggling to work beyond the government and in some case in spite of the government to raise money for needs in that country. And there was somebody from Ukraine who came to Moscow to attend the international conference, and that person invited me to come to Ukraine, which I did. I started working with the largest organization in Ukraine that was supporting kids with cancer, and that led me to 3 other organizations that I work with in Ukraine, and some of which I continue to do. How do I help them? I just help them with what I know. I help them by listening. I help them by probably offering hope. And I don't know, how to offer hope. I don't sit down in the morning and say, well, Tony, how are you going to offer hope today? But if it's by not being afraid to interact and to work with people who are struggling and to work deeply with them and help them with one conversation at a time. Just, one act of kindness at a time, just one step at a time. You're not going to resolve the war, but you can help to alleviate challenge. You can help alleviate suffering. You can help alleviate confusion by one conversation at a time or one act of kindness at a time. And so that's what I try to do, and bring my understanding and discipline and knowledge to those who need it, and to do it with love and kindness.
As we're coming towards the end of this particular conversation, I feel like there's so much more I could ask you, but I'm not sure that the answers are easy because you keep evolving in ways most of us only aspire to do. But let me ask you anyway, as you look forward, what are some of the things that are still undone that you imagine that be the most fun, the most joyful, the most inspiring for you to do? What are you looking forward to next?
The thing that has caught my attention, Jay, is that I see three issues in the nonprofit sector, and I think I've shared those with you. Number one issue is sustainability. That's why there's a whole fundraising enterprise in North America and around the world. Sustainability is an issue for the nonprofit sector. Number two, accountability is such a critical issue. Accountability not only for raising money, but for how we spend money, but accountability in programming, accountability in how we operate our organizations, accountability in how we treat our donors, accountability in how we treat our beneficiaries. And the third issue in the sector for me is leadership. And my future is totally focused on leadership. I think in my last iteration as a operating professional, and in my last iteration in the work I'm doing and dedicated to in philanthropy is working at the whole area of leadership in the nonprofit sector. That's the most important work that needs to be done. And anybody I speak with suggests to me that undeniably that's the most important thing that needs to be done. And so I started that work in my head probably 4 years ago, but I started that work in earnest in recent months, and I'm dedicated to furthering leadership and a leadership program I developed with colleagues in Central and Eastern Europe in 2015, and want to bring that leadership movement to Canada, and that's what I'm working on pro bono full time these days, and that's where the future of my time, energy, enthusiasm, and joy will go into that work over the next 3 to 5 years. It is the most important thing I think I need to do in these final years, in my final active years. And hopefully they all will be active years, but that's what I'm dedicated to doing, totally and completely dedicated to working on that leadership piece, and enthralled by it, excited by it, energized by it, enthused by it, and driven by it. And because it's the most important work that needs to be done now in the NGO sector. In Canada, United States, oh my God, in the United States and in Europe. In the Western world that I'm working in the Eastern world that I'm not as familiar with, in the Southern Hemisphere that I'm not as familiar with. But that's the most important work that needs to be done globally in the NGO sector.
The Philanthropy Masterminds podcast is underwritten by DonorSearch, the world leader in donor intelligence solutions. Our producer is Jack Frost. Our theme music is Be My Remedy, composed and performed by House of Say. You can subscribe to the Philanthropy Masterminds podcast on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. And you can find blogs, webcasts, and CFRE accredited webinars with our featured masterminds at DonorSearch.net, or check the show notes and descriptions.